They tell you African independence was handed down peacefully by civilized colonial powers who saw the light. Black leaders supposedly begged for freedom, got it as a gift, and then proved they couldn't handle it. But there was one African leader who didn't beg. He built something that actually worked. Kwame Nkrumah took Ghana from British colonial rule to the most advanced black nation on earth. Universal healthcare, free education, massive dams and highways, a space program. He was proving that black people could run their own countries better than white colonizers ever did. So why haven't you heard his real story? Because while he was building this African success story, the CIA was watching, and they were terrified. Today, we're diving deep into the man who scared America so much they had to destroy him. Picture Ghana in 1960. Just 3 years after independence, this West African nation had hospitals in villages that never saw a doctor under British rule. Children who would have worked on cocoa farms were learning mathematics and science in brand new schools. The Akosombo Dam was rising from the Volta River, about to become one of the world's largest sources of hydroelectric power. Ghana was launching its own airline, building its own steel mills, training its own engineers. This wasn't some gradual development program stretched over decades. This was a full sprint toward total self-sufficiency in less than 5 years. And the man directing this transformation was getting phone calls from presidents and prime ministers around the world. Because Kwame Nkrumah wasn't just building one successful African country, he was building a model that could destroy colonialism forever. But what made Nkrumah so dangerous wasn't just that he succeeded, it was how he talked about that success. In 1965, he published a book called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. He laid out exactly how European and American companies were keeping African countries poor even after independence, how they would loan money for projects, then demand the contracts go to Western companies using Western workers, how they would buy raw materials cheap, sell finished products back to Africa at high prices, how they would support African leaders who kept this system going and destroy leaders who tried to break it. Nkrumah called it the last stage of imperialism because it was colonialism without the expense of colonial armies, just pure economic control. And he wasn't just explaining the system, he was beating it. Here's where it gets darker. CIA documents released decades later show they were tracking every move Nkrumah made, not because he was communist, not because he was violent, but because he was proving independence could actually work. By 1963, Ghana was hosting conferences where African leaders planned to merge their countries into a United States of Africa. One currency, one government, one military, 300 million people controlling their own gold, diamonds, oil, cocoa, and uranium. No more British mining companies, no more French logging operations, no more American corporations paying African workers 50 cents a day. If Nkrumah's vision succeeded, Western access to African wealth would be over, and Western governments knew it. By the way, this is exactly why we've made this channel. If you want more hidden stories like this, subscribe to Black Stories Untold. Now, back to what happened next. The CIA wasn't just watching Nkrumah, they were building files on every military officer in Ghana, every police commander, every opposition politician. American advisors were training Ghanaian security forces. American companies were offering deals that required Ghana to stay aligned with Western interests. And whenever Nkrumah rejected those deals, American diplomats would meet quietly with his enemies. This wasn't paranoia on Nkrumah's part. This was standard CIA procedure across Africa in the 1960s. They had already helped kill Patrice Lumumba in Congo for the same reason. He wanted Congolese diamonds and cobalt to benefit Congolese people instead of Belgian companies. What the CIA didn't expect was how fast Nkrumah would move. In 1964, he survived an assassination attempt while greeting crowds in Accra. Instead of slowing down, he accelerated. Ghana began offering free university education to students from across Africa. Black Americans were invited to come live in Ghana with full citizenship. W.E.B. Du Bois moved there, and died in Accra in 1963, finally seeing the advanced black nation he had dreamed about. Nkrumah was creating what he called a black Mecca, a place where black excellence could flourish without white interference. And it was working so well that liberation movements from South Africa to Mississippi were using Ghana as their model. But here's what really terrified the CIA. Other African leaders were starting to follow Nkrumah's playbook. Guinea's Ahmed Sekou Touré kicked out French companies and aligned with Ghana. Tanzania's Julius Nyerere began talking about African socialism and unity. Mali's Modibo Keita started hosting Pan-African conferences. The virus was spreading. African leaders were realizing they didn't need to stay economically dependent on their former colonizers. They could trade with each other. They could process their own raw materials. They could tell Western companies to accept African terms or get out. This was the nightmare scenario for Western corporations that had been extracting African wealth for centuries. And this is where everything connects. February 24th, 1966. Nkrumah was in Hanoi, Vietnam, trying to broker peace talks to end the Vietnam War. While he was offering to help America find a way out of Southeast Asia, American agents were coordinating with military officers in Accra to end his presidency. The coup was swift and efficient. Radio stations announced that the military and police had saved Ghana from dictatorship. They promised to restore democracy and fix the economy. Within hours, American and British governments officially recognized the new military regime. No investigation into whether the coup was legitimate. No concern for the millions of Ghanaians who had elected Nkrumah. Just immediate support for the generals who had seized power. Here's what they found when they raided Nkrumah's offices. Plans for a continental African currency backed by gold reserves from multiple countries. Draft agreements for an African common market that would eliminate Western middlemen. Military cooperation treaties that would make it impossible for European powers to intervene in African conflicts. Educational exchange programs that would create a generation of African leaders trained in African universities instead of European ones. Industrial development plans that would turn Africa from a raw material exporter into a manufacturing powerhouse. This wasn't just one man's dream. This was a detailed blueprint for African independence that would have changed global economics forever. The new military government immediately began dismantling everything Nkrumah had built. They invited Western companies back in on pre-independence terms. They canceled the university expansion programs. They stopped supporting liberation movements in other African countries. They aligned Ghana with American foreign policy interests. Within 2 years, Ghana went from being the most advanced black nation on earth to being another poor African country dependent on foreign aid and foreign investment. The transformation that had taken 5 years to build was destroyed in 2 years. And this destruction was celebrated in American and European newspapers as Ghana's return to responsible government. But the damage to Pan-Africanism was even worse than the damage to Ghana. African leaders across the continent saw what happened to Nkrumah and learned the lesson. Dream too big, move too fast, challenge Western economic interests too directly, and you will be removed. The CIA didn't need to overthrow every Pan-Africanist leader. They just needed to make an example of the most successful one. After 1966, African independence movements focused on political freedom without economic independence. They accepted Western investment terms. They kept their raw materials flowing to European and American companies. They never again seriously attempted to unite into a continental federation. Nkrumah spent his last 6 years in exile in Guinea, writing and speaking about what had been destroyed. He died in 1972, never seeing Ghana again. But even in exile, he kept explaining the same truth he had discovered in the 1950s. Political independence without economic independence is a lie. African people would never be truly free until African countries controlled their own wealth. And African countries would never be strong enough to control their own wealth until they united into a continental federation. This was the vision that scared the CIA, not because it was impossible, but because it was completely possible. Here's the grand payoff that connects everything. Kwame Nkrumah wasn't overthrown because he failed as a leader. He was overthrown because he succeeded too much. In 9 years, he had taken a British colonial territory and turned it into a model that could have ended Western economic control over Africa. His success exposed how fragile colonial power really was when Black people controlled their own land, labor, and future. The CIA supported his overthrow not to save Ghana from dictatorship, but to save Western corporations from losing their access to African wealth. And it worked. 60 years later, African countries are still exporting raw materials to Western companies and buying finished products back at high prices, still dependent on Western loans with Western conditions, still waiting for the African unity that Nkrumah proved was possible in the 1960s. This is why you never learned about Nkrumah's real achievements in school, why his books are not taught in African studies courses, why his name is barely mentioned in discussions of the civil rights era, even though he was hosting Black American leaders and offering them citizenship in Africa. The story of his success had to be erased and replaced with a story of African failure. Because if people understood what Nkrumah actually built, they might start asking why no African leader has been allowed to build anything like it since. They might start wondering what Africa would look like today if the CIA had let his experiment continue. They might start demanding that African wealth finally start benefiting African people instead of enriching Western shareholders who never set foot on the continent. This was Black Stories Untold, and as always, thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this, click the video on your screen now.